Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. It's no secret that the racing game genre is currently nowhere near the height it reached during the 2000s. However, whilst it's nice to look back on that era with fondness, we can't pretend that everything was perfect. In current day, the value that video games hold when it comes to marketing is very much known about, and racing games are some of the best examples. Real-life car manufacturers are very keen to have their models feature in these games because they know the benefits this can bring when it comes to brand awareness. Of course, also being paid handsomely for this privilege I'm sure doesn't hurt. As such, in most modern racing games, there's the potential for almost any car from any brand to appear should the desire be strong enough, with a handful of exceptions. But it wasn't always like this. Although there had been games featuring real cars already, 1997's Gran Turismo was truly a breakthrough in this respect. It featured hundreds of models from several Japanese and international car makers, establishing a precedent that would go on to influence countless other titles. But even though many car brands were quick to jump on this bandwagon, that wasn't the case for all of them. Over the following decade or so, the most prestigious European brands like Ferrari, Lamborghini, and Porsche only made very occasional video game appearances owing to things like exclusivity deals, exorbitant licensing fees, or just flat out refusing to appear in certain titles. Even the likes of Gran Turismo, which had since become a gaming juggernaut, didn't feature official cars from any of these brands in a mainline title until 2010. For players, not being able to drive many of their favourite cars in their favourite racing games was obviously a frustrating situation. But this didn't stop developers from coming up with their own interesting ways around it. But just for a second, imagine a racing game that has hundreds of varied and interesting cars, but you can only ever drive maybe 10 of them. That doesn't sound fair at all, does it? Well, that's not too dissimilar to what it's like browsing the internet without using today's sponsor, private internet access. Many streaming sites like Netflix have content which can only be found in specific regions, but with servers in more than 90 different countries, including 50 in the US alone, no matter where you are in the world, private internet access makes it easy to enjoy more content on every major streaming service. And that's not all it can do. Encryption of your internet connection is another huge benefit, preventing any of your personal data ending up in the hands of people who shouldn't have it. For instance, I recently went overseas and sometimes found myself having to use free public Wi-Fi. Not exactly ideal, but having private internet access, I knew that I was totally protected on each of my devices, as the app works on all platforms with just a single subscription. With over 30 million downloads and a strict no-logs policy, it's no wonder that private internet access is one of the world's top VPNs. So, what are you waiting for? Sign up today using my link, piavpn.com/rofflewaffle, to get an incredible 83% off and 4 months absolutely free. And if you're not totally satisfied for whatever reason, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. Many thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring the channel. Now, back to the video. The issue of racing games not being able to include certain real cars was a very widespread problem, affecting countless franchises. However, I have identified 3 main workarounds that have been employed by games like these over the years. The first of these is easily the most common. If you can't include a particular car, just make your own one. Yes, fictional cars are something that you can find in many different games, and not just ones focused on racing. The benefits of doing this are fairly obvious. For one, you don't have to pay any licensing fees. As long as your made-up car isn't 100% identical to the real one, you can just change the badges, the name, and hey presto, you've got your own recreation of the real thing. The second benefit for game devs is that they have total creative freedom with what they can do with these cars. Crash damage has always been a point of contention in racing games, as whilst it is generally favoured by players, car makers often have a very different stance. The ability to completely wreck cars somewhat goes against the philosophy for giving out these licenses in the first place, which is to show them, and by extension the brand, in the best light possible. As such, many racing games that feature real cars often have very limited damage, if any, something which is only becoming more restrictive as time goes on. Given that, it's no surprise that racing games where crashing and damaging your car is a core aspect of the gameplay almost always include their own made-up models, something that's still true even today. And it's not just about what you can do to these cars, but also the nature of the game they appear in. Grand Theft Auto is arguably the biggest franchise in gaming right now, with GTA 6 widely expected to rewrite the record books much like its predecessor when it eventually releases. But what you won't find in it, or any other GTA game, is officially licensed vehicles. The more adult and explicit themes of these games represent a pretty major red flag to any real-world brand, and probably none more so than car makers. Players being able to mow down pedestrians in a real Ferrari, for example, wouldn't exactly be a great look. The third and final benefit of making fictional cars is more to do with the cars themselves. Thus far, I've only approached this from the angle of using them as replacements for real ones, but that ignores their potential as totally unique models. Many racing games feature original cars that stand alone as their own thing. They may take certain styling cues from real cars, but it's all put together in a way that makes them feel distinct. In this respect, the decision to use fictional cars could be a purely creative choice, rather than a way to get around licensing. Of course, this isn't really relevant to the topic of this video, but it's still interesting to consider. Now, whilst coming up with fictional takes on real cars works for some racing games, it's not a catch-all solution. Not to put down certain franchises, but generally for a racing game to be taken seriously, it has to include real cars, especially if it centers on realistic driving. Also, it isn't a great solution in cases where most other cars can be licensed. Games that feature both licensed and unlicensed cars as playable vehicles are extremely few and far between, and in concept, the idea just feels wrong. So, let's move on to workaround number 2. If you can't include a particular car, just find a similar car you can include instead. This method is far less common, but there are a few notable examples I'm aware of. If we check out Gran Turismo 2, we can find cars from Vector and Venturi. I think of these cars as like stand-ins for models that they couldn't get in the game, namely from Ferrari and Lamborghini. Now, a certain amount of this will be based on intentions, which we can never know for certain. For example, who's to say that if cars from Ferrari and Lamborghini were in GT2, that these cars wouldn't have appeared anyway? However, I still feel fairly confident in my assessments. Back in the 90s, when these cars were still current, and before both companies went bankrupt, the comparisons were obvious. Venturi in particular pretty much built its identity around being the French Ferrari. Just one look at their 400 GT made this point even more obvious. In the case of Vector, their M12 was powered by a version of the V12 found in the Lamborghini Diablo, and the Italian marque even had a hand in developing the car as both brands were briefly under the same ownership. Neither Vector nor Venturi returned in any of the games after GT2, but there was another car that filled a similar niche. The Chisetta V16T debuted in GT4. This car was an even more direct stand-in, as it was based on the original prototype for the Lamborghini Diablo drawn up by Marcello Gandini. The main difference though was that it had 4 more cylinders, as the name implies. What's interesting is that this car would reappear in GT5 and GT6 where Lamborghini is present. In the latter, it even featured alongside its half-brother. Of course, I'm not trying to say that these cars don't have their own intrinsic value beyond being stand-ins for much more well-known models. In fact, one of the upsides of this method in particular is exactly that. These cars are unique and interesting in their own right. Outside of Gran Turismo, Vector, Venturi, and Chisetta have featured in hardly any other racing games, which makes their appearances here really special. Honestly, it's quite ironic. The main reason why they appeared in the first place was as substitutes for the cars we couldn't get. But now that we have those cars, many of us still miss them and wish that they'll return in newer games. You can never have it both ways, I suppose. So, we've looked at fictional cars and stand-in cars, so what about the third and final workaround? Well, for me, this is the most interesting method, and also the main reason why I wanted to make this video in the first place. If you can't include a particular car, find a way to regardless. Yes, these are cases where developers are able to make the impossible possible. Now, I'm not talking about games including cars they don't actually have the rights to, although I'm sure that has happened at least once before. What I mean is when games use a loophole to include a version of a car that they wouldn't normally be able to. There are quite a few examples of this over the years, but let me start with the most obvious. For the longest while, Porsche was the most elusive brand in racing games. In 2000, EA released Need for Speed Porsche Unleashed, marking the beginning of an exclusivity deal with the brand that would last for the next 16 years. During this time, cars from Porsche would only appear in games published by EA. There were 1 or 2 exceptions though, such as Forza, which was on occasion able to sub-license the cars from EA for a hefty fee. However, that was a luxury that most other games weren't able to afford, so they had to think outside of the box. Roof is a German company that had been modifying Porsches since the 1970s. In the late 80s, they gained global recognition when their highly tuned version of the Porsche 911, called the CTR but often referred to by the nickname Yellowbird, became the fastest production car in the world. But for the sake of this video, something even more important happened just a few years earlier. In 1983, Roof began producing the BTR. Rather than simply modifying existing Porsches, between 20 and 30 of the cars produced were built up from bare 911 chassis. The work done to create them was so substantial that they were officially recognised as not just modified Porsches, but entirely distinct models in their own right. This process would be carried forward into the cars Roof would produce thereafter, thus establishing them as a full-on manufacturer. And so, when Gran Turismo was unable to secure the Porsche license in 1999, they turned to Roof. 8 models, all of which based on various versions of the Porsche 911, would appear in GT2. Whilst it wasn't technically the first racing game to ever feature Roof, it was the first to use them as a direct replacement for Porsche. And as they say, the rest is history. Cars from Roof since went on to appear in pretty much every other major racing game franchise, from Test Drive Unlimited to Forza, Assetto Corsa, The Crew, Driver, Project Cars, and plenty more. If you name a non-EA published racing game with real cars that released in the 2000s, you can almost certainly find at least one Roof model in it. And as the company began to expand its range beyond just the 911, such as with cars based on the Boxster and Cayman, and even their own completely original CTR3, their presence continued to grow. At least until 2017. This was the year in which Porsche's tie-up with EA finally came to an end, allowing cars from the Stuttgart brand to appear pretty much anywhere. This was great news for the racing game genre, but not so much for Roof. Since then, cars from the company have become a rare sight in games. In fact, so sudden was the shift that there was even speculation that Porsche was deliberately pushing Roof out, having become uncomfortable with just how much attention their cars were getting. However, they've not disappeared entirely. Gran Turismo 7, for example, currently features 2 Roof models, the CTR3 and also the 2016 RGT. The latter of those is based on the 991 generation 911, a car that also appears in GT7, showing that it is still possible for both Porsche and Roof to coexist in a current racing game. In spite of the unfortunate situation that sparked their inclusion, Roof is a brand that a lot of people think of fondly, in a big part thanks to appearing in so many classic racing games. But when it came to legally distinct Porsche-based vehicles, Roof wasn't the only option. Gambala is another German company that got its start modifying various domestic cars. In 1981, they launched their first complete car, the 911-based Gambala Slant Nose, and much like Roof, continued to produce more in the years after. When it came to racing games, Gambala cars were not especially common, but they did make a few notable appearances. Tokyo Extreme Racer 3 featured the GTR 500 and GTR 750, based on the Boxster and 996 911 respectively, and Toka Race Driver 3 even had a semi-fictional racing variant of the GTR 750. But the game that most people remember Gambala from the best is Midnight Club 3 Dub Edition. This game featured the 996-based Gambala Turbo Coupe, as well as the Cayenne-based GT750 in the remix re-release of the game, but it also included something else. This is the Gambala F355 in its so far only video game appearance. As far as the real car goes, there's very little information about it on the internet, but thanks to these pictures we do know that it existed, most likely as a one-off model. It's essentially just a lightly modified Ferrari 355 Berlinetta, but its existence meant that it could be used as a loophole car that allowed Ferrari to appear in the game unofficially. Given just how protective Ferrari is of their IP, I'm honestly kind of impressed that they managed to pull this off, but at the same time, not at all surprised that nobody else did. Whilst the Porsche loopholes were naturally the most prevalent given EA's exclusivity, the Gambala F355 shows that it was possible for other brands to slip through the cracks. Once again, let's take a step back to Gran Turismo 2. There are leftover text strings in the game files implying that cars from Porsche, Ferrari, Lamborghini and McLaren were planned to appear in it at one point or another. Of course, due to the difficulty with licensing these brands at the time, these never happened. But what's interesting to note is that each of the cars mentioned here competed in the All Japan GT Championship, the forerunner to Super GT, and whilst none of them would appear in GT2, this didn't stop Gran Turismo from trying. Just a few months before the release of Gran Turismo 3, the Nomad Diablo GT1 was unveiled in screenshots. Previous iterations of the car were mentioned in those GT2 leftovers, so how was Polyphony able to pull this off in GT3? Well, let me explain. The Diablo GT1 was originally conceived by a French company called Signa Advanced Technology under orders from Lamborghini. Other than the engine, which was bored out to 6 litres, it shared very little with the road-going Diablo. The plan was that Lamborghini was going to race the car as a works GT1 machine in places like the FIA GT Championship and even the 24 Hours of Le Mans. However, financial difficulties ultimately killed the project, and the single race car chassis built was sold off. As it turned out, the new owners of the Diablo GT1 were the Japanese Lamborghini Owners Club, or JLOC for short. They had been competing with Lamborghinis in the GT500 class at the JGTC since its inception in 1994, and so the Diablo GT1 was put to work as their new race car starting in 1997. And it's the 2000 version of this car that would go on to appear in Gran Turismo 3. As Lamborghini had since cut all ties to the car, Gran Turismo instead licensed it directly from JLOC, hence it being known in-game as simply the Diablo JGTC. Whilst Gran Turismo was able to get away with this sneaky tactic to begin with, Lamborghini soon caught wind. So, even though this car still appears in the initial Japanese release of GT3, it's not playable in international versions at the direct request of Lamborghini. It was a compromise that disappointed many, but the end result is that GT3 does technically feature a Lamborghini, of sorts, without holding the official license. Also, here's a neat bit of trivia you probably didn't know. In the Japanese intro movie of GT3, there's a scene that features a field of GT500 cars at Trial Mountain, of which the Diablo is included. What's interesting about this is that this scene still appears in the NTSCU and PAL intros, and even though it was cropped and shortened to try and hide it, the Diablo is actually still visible for a few frames. To be honest, I only realised this when I was editing a video and coincidentally stopped on one of these frames. When it comes to the car's depiction in the game, it's almost identical to the real thing. The only difference is that the Raging Bull logos had to be scrubbed off the front and sides of the car for obvious reasons. Unfortunately, Polyphony weren't able to pull off the same trick twice, and the car did not reappear in GT4. But with the series finally gaining the Lamborghini license in 2010, the Diablo GT1 made a surprise return in GT5 and subsequently GT6. In these games, it is now officially recognised as a Lamborghini and also includes the Raging Bull logos that were missing in GT3. In case you want to know more about the real-life car, I actually made a video documenting its strange story a while back. The link to that is on screen now and also in the description. The tactic of licensing a car through the team who campaigned it, rather than the company that made it, is admittedly pretty clever, and the JLOC Diablo in GT3 is not the only example of this we've ever seen. If we once again look at that leftover text from GT2, we can find the SOK McLaren GTR. This is another car that competed in GT500 alongside the Diablo. Of course, there are no McLaren F1s in GT2, despite the North American box art featuring the road car's interior, with the F1 logo even being clearly visible on the dials. No, we would have to wait until GT4 to get our first taste of this car in the series. In this game, it's known as the BMW McLaren F1 GTR. With the McLaren F1's triumph at Le Mans in 1995, the car was now a proven force in sports car racing. Because of this, BMW, who supplied the F1's 6-litre V12, decided to step up their involvement with the car in GT racing. This came to a point in 1997 when they helped to develop the upgraded long-tail version of the F1 GTR. This year, BMW took charge of the factory program in the new FIA GT Championship, with Schnitzer Motorsport running the cars under the banner of Team BMW Motorsports. So, with Gran Turismo still unable to acquire the McLaren license, they worked out a deal with BMW to feature the Team BMW Motorsport F1 GTR. And even though the series would eventually get the McLaren license starting with GT5, this car is still labelled as a BMW in every game since. However, this time around, Gran Turismo wasn't alone in doing this. A notable example is R Racing Evolution, a GT rival from Ridge Racer developers Namco. This game predates GT4 and even GT4 Prologue in also featuring the F1 GTR as a BMW. This is also the case in the original Forza Motorsport and Enthusia Professional Racing. Although what's unique about that last case is that it's the 1996 short-tail version, specifically the number 38 car that ran at Le Mans under the banner of Team Bugatti SRL, but with backing from BMW. And whilst we're on the topic of Enthusia, that leads us neatly to the final example I want to talk about. In this game, you can find a Bugatti EB110, but yet again, its inclusion isn't so straightforward. Bugatti is definitely up there as one of the most prestigious European brands, but for a while it featured in barely any racing games. The company was mostly dormant since the 1960s, until being revived in the late 80s under new Italian ownership. The new owners set about designing a flagship supercar, and this was unveiled in 1991 as the EB110. Ultimately, this would be the only model produced by the company under its Italian guise, as a combination of factors, including an economic downturn, resulted in the brand ceasing production of the car at the end of 1995, before being taken over by Volkswagen in 1998. However, before VW acquired it, Bugatti sold off the rights to the EB110, as well as some of the remaining parts, including 5 unfinished chassis, to a German company called Dauer Sportwagen. If that name sounds familiar, there's a good reason why. Dauer initially started as a racing team in the 1980s competing in Group C, but soon turned their attention to converting Porsche 962s into road cars. This road-going version, known as the Dauer 962, would become quite famous, even holding the title of world's fastest production car for a time. But using this car, Porsche realized that they could re-enter their 962 back into racing in the GT class instead. And so, this is what they did, taking the Dauer 962 to victory at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1994. Even though the loophole that allowed the car to compete was almost immediately closed off, Dauer still continued to produce road-legal 962s for many years after. But their acquisition of Bugatti's leftovers gave them a new avenue to pursue. They soon set to work on improving the EB110 and finishing the 5 remaining chassis. Of the changes they implemented, the most drastic was the use of carbon fiber body panels, saving roughly 200 kilograms. Power was also increased to around 650 horsepower, and the final product was christened the Dauer EB110 Super Sport Lightweight. All 5 of the unfinished chassis were made into Dauer EB110s between 2001 and 2002. However, this isn't the car we see in Enthusia. No, instead the model we have here is the original EB110, but rebranded as a Dauer. It isn't even the Supersport version, as most evident from its wheel design and specs which match the original GT model. In spite of this, the EB110 is still hands down one of the fastest road cars in this game, but given how the career is designed to incentivize players to drive slower cars and achieve underdog results, that's not actually a good thing. Still, it was a really neat way to get the EB110 into the game. So there we are. Whether it be models from Porsche, Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren or Bugatti, various racing game developers have found alternate ways to get versions of these cars into their games at one point or another. When you look at all of these examples together, you really have to applaud their ingenuity. In some ways, exploiting these licensing loopholes is like a lost art. Because high-end car makers are so much more open to the idea of appearing in racing games than they were 20 to 25 years ago, loophole cars just aren't really a thing anymore. But there is another factor at play. One of the most notable ongoing licensing disputes is between Lotus and Gran Turismo. I've covered this in the past, but inside sources at Lotus have implied that the issue is monetary, with Gran Turismo being unwilling to pay Lotus what they believe they deserve for licensing their cars because of the precedent it may set with other manufacturers. But let's just imagine a hypothetical scenario where there is a way to get Lotus cars in GT7 through a licensing loophole, similar to the ones we've already covered. If this were possible, do you think Gran Turismo would take advantage of it? Personally, I would say no. In current day, car manufacturers work much more closely with racing game developers and publishers, almost like a partnership. Gran Turismo is easily the best example of this, with their Vision GT concept cars even being designed in collaboration with these brands. This is also one of the reasons why modeled car damage has become noticeably worse than it was 15 to 20 years ago, because it's all about keeping the brands happy. So in that respect, I don't think Gran Turismo would want to go behind Lotus's back in this hypothetical scenario because of the risk of upsetting Lotus and, more importantly, their parent company Geely, who also owns Volvo, which does have cars in GT7. So, the long-term impact of doing that could be worse than just accepting the current situation with Lotus. All of this means that even if there were cases where Loophole Cars could be used, it's nowhere near as simple as it used to be. Of course, out of the 3 licensing workarounds I've outlined in this video, Loophole Cars are not only the most interesting, but also the most desirable from the player's perspective. Even though many of these cars differ from the real things in appearance, performance, and more, they still gave the opportunity for millions of players to experience these cars in games they otherwise wouldn't have. And when you really think about it, that's pretty damn cool. All of the examples I've covered today are ones I know about either through playing these games or my own research, but I'm positive there are more cases I haven't mentioned. So, if you know about any other interesting licensing workarounds in racing games, please let me know about them in the comments. But for now, thanks for watching and have a good one.